Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about Bartimaeus, the Amulet of Samarkand by Jonathan Stroud. Okay, so if you are one of the maybe 2 people that watch all my videos, you might remember that I have mentioned this book before. Specifically, I was not sure if I had read it before. Like, I own book 2, and I don't generally buy book 2s if I have not read book 1, or if they do own them, they sit on my to-be-read shelf until the end of time. But more importantly, I sort of vaguely had some memories of reading this book, but also not. And I got the feeling that the second book was sent to me by my sister, but that was all I could remember. And it was just this nagging feeling in the back of my mind of, have I read this book or not? And eventually I just gave in and bought the book and read it. And I can now definitively say, with complete assurance, especially considering my sister unearthed a photo of me sitting on a train in DC holding this book, but I can also definitively just say, because I recognize the book, I have read it. Sorta. It seems I got about 2/3 of the way through and just stopped, which is really unusual for me. Like, up until about 5 years ago, I never failed to finish books. Like, it was not something I did. And so it's odd that I did with this book. And part of me thinks what happened is I might have left it on that train in DC, or even just left it somewhere on that trip and lost it. But the important thing is, there's also the possibility that I just failed to finish it because I found it intrinsically very, very annoying. But there's also some really interesting concepts in it, which probably stuck with me to lead me to think that I had finished it, which is why when my sister sent me the second one, I read it going, yeah, of course I've read this. Have I? But let's start with what this book is. Okay, so the Bartimaeus Trilogy focuses on a 12-year-old magician's apprentice named Nathaniel, and the djinn he summons, Bartimaeus. In this world, magic is practiced by magicians summoning spirits to do all the work for them. And it's this sort of a dystopian world. Like, it takes place in a version of England that is similar to ours, clearly set in roughly the same time period as ours, but unlike our England, this one kept its empire and in fact continued to expand its empire. Like, by the time we get to this book, it feels like I got the impression that England owned at least, like, the majority of Europe. Like, there's a reference to Italy, like, trying to rebel. But the important thing is that the empire is ruled by magicians. They are wealthy, powerful, and they heavily look down on all non-magicians who they call commoners. And the magicians don't have children, so the next generation of magicians are taken from the commoners. Like, specifically, parents bring their kids in to have them tested, and if the kid shows high potential, the parent is paid and the kid is taken away and given to a random magician to be his master. And the magician will raise them and train them up. Nathaniel was assigned to a master named Underwood when he was 6 years old, and Underwood is uncaring, unempathetic, he's a hair cruel, and most infuriating to Nathaniel, he's just not that exceptionally powerful. Now, when Nathaniel's master either is unwilling or unable to protect him from a humiliating and abusive punishment, Nathaniel decides he's gonna set out on an epic quest for revenge. But as often happens in quests of revenge, this quickly spirals out of control. And before he knows it, Nathaniel is left fighting for his life and the stability of his entire government. And here's the problem I have with this book. I fucking hate Nathaniel. Like, he is arrogant, pretentious, uncaring, and a brat who seems just shy of incapable of thinking about how his actions could affect anyone but himself. And that's part of the point of the book. Like, Nathaniel is very clearly pointed as a portrait of how a child could be if he was so thoroughly twisted by this weird specific mixture of privilege and a complete lack of human compassion. Now, Nathaniel is raised for those 6 years between when he's 6 and when he's 12, constantly being told that he is destined to rule, that he, by bent of being a magician, which is something he has not chosen and he has no control over, but just because he has this inborn ability, he is innately better than all commoners. and that because he is more powerful than anyone else, he's going to do more important things, and that he's going to do great things. And the implication here is that he's just going to do things, and because he is great, the things will be great. So basically, he is just a little ball of privilege. But on top of that, he also completely lacks all interactions that would teach him how to be human. Like, he has no friends whatsoever. In fact, up until his life falls apart 2/3 of the way through the book, we never see him once talk to or interact with any children. And in fact, even amongst the adults in his life, he only has 2 tutors, one of whom disappears at one point, Mrs. Underwood, the master's wife, and the master himself. And of those, only one of the tutors and Mrs. Underwood seem to care about him at all. And Miss Underwood, while she's a very kind and loving figure, we never see her try to teach him anything like morality. Like, she never reprimands him, she never tells him, hey, maybe be nice to other people. The only person who does anything like that is Miss Lutens, who is one of his tutors. And his actual master, like, he's occasionally shown as being actively cruel, but more often he is shown as barely taking any notice whatsoever of Nathaniel, and when he does notice him at all, it's in a demeaning and dismissive way. So basically, Nathaniel is completely surrounded by privilege, but also completely lacking all the human care that a person needs. And he is being raised in a way that seems to be handcrafted to build an arrogant asshole. And this is shown as normal for magicians. This is what the system is building. The adult magicians we see are all cold, cruel, lacking in compassion and empathy, and also completely wound up in their own, like, ambition and desire for power. And, like, it's a clever way of building a dystopia. Because one of the things that I always find is a problem with dystopian fiction is there's always that point where the reader's going, yeah, but did no one step in to stop this? Did no one say, hey, this is going too far? And, like, there is objectively truth to that, because, like, horrible things do happen in the real world, and people don't stop it. But the thing is, if you look at the real world examples, there are always people trying to step in and stop it that have to be, you know, gotten rid of. And a lot of dystopian fiction doesn't bother showing us that. It gives the impression that, like, oh yeah, just, like, one person suggested this crazy idea and everyone went with it. And this book is not like that. This book has shown us how this horrific system has been built by showing us that everyone who is in power are all the magicians who are all raised basically to be evil. Power is intrinsically concentrated in the hands of people who are lacking all humanity. And that's just gonna lead to some bad shit. Then you add in the actual magic system itself. So the magic system here is built on enslaving spirits, and that means that no shit, the magicians are monsters. And this book does not shy away from the fact that the magic is built on the abuse and exploitation of sentient beings. Like, about half of the book is from Bartimaeus' point of view, and he talks about it a lot. It's very clear that's what's going on. And he is by far the more interesting and likable character. Partially because he is clearly the more honest of our two narrators. Bartimaeus is arrogant, but he is straightforward about it. And he still manages to include and draw attention to his own failings and his flaws. Like, he shows moments where he messed up, and, like, in the footnote he'll comment something like, that was not my best decision. But also, he shows significantly more empathy than Nathaniel does, even while he's constantly wishing death on his master. And on top of all that, there's the simple fact of he is the one enslaved. He has no choice about being involved in all this BS, and he is actively trying to get away from it. He is just trying to survive and gain his own freedom, which are two desires that I think we can all have empathy for. But, so, in the end, Bartimaeus is the more likable, enjoyable, empathetic character. And interestingly enough, actually, Nathaniel is significantly more empathetic, or more likable, that is, from Bartimaeus' point of view, because Bartimaeus actually shows Nathaniel's weaknesses, his childishness, and his unsurety. Like, from when you're reading from Nathaniel's point of view, he's just walking around being like, yes, I know exactly what I'm doing, I never forget anything, I have a plan, I'm 12 and everyone keeps looking down on me, but it's stupid because I'm smart. And then we see him from Bartimaeus' point of view, and he's stuttering, he's shivering, he's looking around unsure what to do, he's hugging mirrors. Like, he's clearly a broken, sad child. And those are things that don't show up from Nathaniel's point of view, which actually helps to increase the likability of both Nathaniel and Bartimaeus, because we see Bartimaeus' empathy in the moments that he's noticing, like, oh my god, this child is so sad. But the point is, this is all very cleverly done. It is saying some really important things about how privilege and isolation affect human growth. And I think it's drawing a very clear, like, mirror to the way that the people of higher classes in our society are raised. Like, this does sound an awful lot like the way a lot of rich kids are raised. And it's created this beautifully logical and believable dystopia. And Nathaniel, when we see him from both point of view, we get this impression of a much more interesting, complex character, and just that still does not answer the fact that he is intensely annoying, dislikable, and hard to read. If it weren't for how much I like Bartimaeus as a character, I probably would not have finished this book a second time, too. But on the other hand, Bartimaeus, he's fun, he's playful, he's intelligent in a way that is very reminiscent of the tricksy servant characters that are prominent in classical theater. It's fun watching him defeat those stronger than him. And the moments we see of him being cruel and violent are written in such a light, playful way that they just make him seem the fun level of dangerous. Like, there is something inhuman about him, but he's a likable inhuman. He is by far the strongest and best part of this book. And there's something sort of sad about that, because objectively there's a really interesting story under the story that we have here. And I don't mean that the way that I sometimes do when I say that, like, there's a good story underneath this book, where it's like the author just missed their book, like they were focused on this detail when that detail over there was by far the more interesting one. Like, that is what's going on, but I do think Jonathan Stroud did that on purpose. So, beyond the narration of Nathaniel on his stupid revenge quest, there's actually a revolution broiling under the surface. There are actually two of them, but one of them is actually interesting. One of them is a revolution of the commoners coming up to, you know, defeat the evil upper class. Basically, the story that you see in most dystopian fiction. But it's barely in this book. We see seeds of it dropped here and there. Objectively, Nathaniel has not realized yet that he is living in a dystopia. He thinks the world is right. Even when characters directly tell him, hey, this is not okay, he's just sort of confused by it, going like, what? Why would the commoners rise up? They obviously have to be happy that we rule them, that this 12-year-old boy has more power than them. Like, he is part of the privileged class. And that's an interesting thing here, because very few dystopian novels are written from the point of view of a character in the privileged class. Usually, they're written from the perspective of one of the oppressed people, because the author wants us to have empathy for the oppressed. We want to see the oppressed win. And this is a book that is a dystopia written from the point of view of one of the oppressors. And yeah, Nathaniel is the lowest rung of the ladder of the privileged class, because he's just an apprentice, but he's still on that ladder. And in fact, by the end of the book, he's moved up a rung, not down a rung. And we see no increase in empathy in him throughout the book. And overall, this creates a feeling that we're sort of following the wrong protagonist. Like, there was someone else that would have made this book better if we had focused on them. And still, I do think Jonathan Stroud did that on purpose. There's part of me that's really wondering if this entire book was just a message of, hey, maybe we should stop writing books about wealthy, powerful white boys and focus instead on more interesting protagonists. But that didn't make the book more likable. I also want to very quickly just talk a little bit about the inspiration of this world. So, like, all fantasy is based on some form of world mythology. And objectively, most common is Northern European mythology. We see a lot of what looks like medieval Europe in books. We see a lot of dragons, mermaids, fairies, elves, dwarves, druids, and druid-inspired priests. And I think this is largely thanks to, specifically, Tolkien. Because Tolkien is sort of the building block of modern fantasy, a lot of what we see as just normal fantasy tropes are medieval European mythology. We'll also see a lot of Greco and Roman mythology in fantasy, like a lot of gods that act like Zeus and Hera and Apollo, but also naiads and nymphs and centaurs. And there's a lot of fantasy that now combines the two. And in fact, nowadays, we're beginning to finally see fantasy that reaches out further afield, like fantasy based on North American, Native American mythology, fantasy based on Asian mythology, on African mythology, on Southeast Islander mythology. We are seeing more expansive, broad world mythology coming into our fantasy, and I love it. But Bartimaeus is doing something that's unlike both of those. So Bartimaeus, the spirits in this world, like the jinn and the, what are referred to as demons by the magicians, they are clearly based on Eastern European and Middle Eastern mythology. But the actual magic system, that's something very specific. That is specifically Renaissance Europe. Specifically, Faustus. And, like, Faust is name-dropped a couple of times in this book. Like, it's clear that the author is not hiding where he got his inspiration from. There are Easter eggs. But it's a very weird, specific mythology because it just doesn't show up in a lot of fantasy. We generally want our wizards and our magicians to have the power intrinsic in themselves. And the only power that these magicians seem to have is the power to call and contain the spirits. And it's the spirits doing everything that's actually cool. And that is something that, yeah, was believed. That was how magic worked. In, like, the days of the 15 and 1600s in Europe. And this creates this weird feeling that it's both very new and novel because it's something that you don't see in a lot of fantasy, while also being intrinsically archaic and old-fashioned. And I think that's why I remembered this book as being weird to place in its time period, because objectively, yeah, this is very clearly set around the time it was written in the early 2000s. Like, there are computers, there are references to cars, like, this is clearly modern world. But there's also something that feels vaguely Victorian about a lot of the bits. There's something that feels sort of Renaissance-y, something that feels really ancient, and something that feels sort of futuristic. Like, there are these imps that work as basically spy droids flying around. And this all combines into this weird mishmash of, like, time periods. Adding to it is the fact that, like, as I mentioned earlier, Bartimaeus is an archetypical tricksy servant character. And this is a character that appears in a lot of plays from Greek theater, ancient Greek theater, but also in, like, Shakespearean plays. This is a character that appears in Figaro, in Commedia dell'arte. And it's not a character you see a lot in modern media, which I think is a tragedy because, frankly, the tricksy servant that is constantly winning over his wealthy, powerful master is a character that I think a lot of people would enjoy in modern media. But Bartimaeus is bringing in a archetype that has not been seen in a lot of modern books, and the book is built on this really cool world and magic system. And, like, that world and magic system also has a lot to say about power and oppression, about how we learn empathy, and what happens when we choose to ignore empathy. But I just can't get past the hurdle of the fact that the main character is too fucking annoying to read. This came out at a time that it was relatively common for middle grade and young adult books, especially those marketed to boys, to feature gray protagonists. Protagonists that are almost anti-heroes, and sometimes directly are anti-heroes. I'm thinking mainly about Artemis Fowl here. But I did not like this trend. And I always thought it was because I didn't feel like a middle grade fiction really has enough room and, like, mental space to, like, delve the depths that you need to create a likable anti-hero. But this book also disproves that, because Bartimaeus is a likable anti-hero in what is an old middle grade, early young adult book. Like, that is what he is. He is an intensely likable character. And it's just that Nathaniel is not. So in the end, I think that this book would have been 100% better if it was just written entirely from the perspective of Bartimaeus. But that's just my opinion.